This is a discussion about Ocbil theory, the southwest Australian floristic region, and a little bit on the, in conclusion, on the research team at the Centre of Excellence in Natural Resource Management at UWA Albany. The aim of the talk is to give you some sense of some recent and relatively exciting scientific research as well as cross-cultural research that has really made a difference, I think, in beginning to understand how to care for country, how to care for, conserve and understand the evolution and ecology of the native plants in particular, but also animals and human cultures in landscapes comparable to the southwest Australian floristic region. I'm on slide 2, and a few fundamental principles. Firstly, in terms of managing country, managing biodiversity, you really have to understand phenomena at what I call the mesoscale. So the slide illustrates 3 levels of understanding. The microscale, which for example could be typical of a PhD, where a scientist specialises on a plant or animal group, or a human cultural group for that matter, or some process, and understands bits of the system, how they're working, how they evolve. The mesoscale is about management and outcomes achieved at the landscape level, and this is particularly important, I think, in terms of Aboriginal understanding of caring for country. There's a reference here to a wonderful paper by Fiona Walsh and colleagues from Alice Springs, which draw upon Aboriginal knowledge about caring for country and use plant examples to explain it, and it's portrayed at the mesoscale level, objectively and deliberately. The macroscale is about trying to generalise, then involves formulating theory that can be full of testable hypotheses, can be about cosmology, about overall human understanding of how the universe works, and embraces religious perceptions as well as scientific perceptions. And it is about generalisation at global scale. And I just issue a caution here that we have to be really aware of and beware of confusion with what I call global moshing or correlation. So in science these days, with databases what they are and computers what they are, it's very easy for people to assemble databases of studies that aren't really comparable, they're apples and oranges, and drawing generalisations that I think really are about correlations at best and don't get at causation at all in terms of understanding process. And they're called what I call global moshing, and they really are a problem, and generate confusion because people think they find a correlation and therefore they understand how the world and the universe works, whereas we all know that correlation is just that. Causation requires experimentation to establish unequivocally. Moving on to slide 3 now, I just want to define the southwest Australian floristic region, and a colleague of mine, Paul Joyer, and I have published a paper in 2017 recently in the Botanical Journal of the Linnean Society, in which we have looked at the geographical distribution of some 400,000 specimens in the West Australian herbarium, each of which is accurately geo-referenced, and asked fundamental questions about the flora. How many species of native and weed species are there in the southwest? Well, there's close to 8,400 native vascular plant species. That includes ferns and fern allies as well as flowering plants. About 82% of the total flora is native, and about 20%, 18%, are subspecies rather than species. So in taxonomy, one botanist subspecies may be another's species, and vice versa. And we know that around half, 47% of the species in the southwest are endemic, found nowhere else on the planet. And we live in an exciting age of discovery, so we also know that about half, 49% of the species, the 8,400 native species I'm talking about, have been described just since 1970, in the last 50 years. Now we applied a grid system of quarter-degree latitude, longitude across the southwest and up to 70 kilometres further inland into the arid zone in this analysis, and used computer algorithms to generate multiple samples of native species collected in these grid squares, and then treated them effectively as quadrats as you do an ecological analysis, and applied the same sort of computer analyses of what's called classification and ordination to work out basically which quarter-degree grid squares were most similar in species composition and which were most different. So that generates a dendrogram. Is one way of presenting the ultimate classification, which is hierarchical. So you start at the biggest split in the dendrogram, and it indicates the major divides in similarity relationships. And it can also produce a two-way bivariate plot called an ordination in multivariate space, which emphasises continuity across the grid squares as well. On slide 3 is the outcome of our analysis. So we were able to determine that there is a cogent boundary for the southwest Australian floristic region, which runs, according to our analysis now, from Shark Bay down to Israelite Bay, East Esperance. And you'll notice that the region boundary is drawn coarsely and thickly here, and that's signalling that it's a permeable boundary and not a precise boundary along geospatial terrain. So that's the regional boundary. Within the region we recognise 4 provinces with a thinner boundary line, indicating a greater degree of precision and repeatability occurred in our analysis for these. So 2 of those 4 botanical provinces are ones resembling those that Paul Joyer and I published previously in a paper in 2004. That's the southeast coastal province, we call it, and the transitional rainfall province. But 2 are new in composition. One completely new, called the Kalbarri province, and the second one called the Bibbulmun province, which embraces 2 new regions outside the forest zone, which traditionally were recognised in past floristic classifications by myself included in 1979. I called it the high rainfall zone, and it only included the Jarrah and Muir districts in our map on slide 3. So within each of those 4 provinces we then identified with dashed lines, which are thinner again, and these are the most repeatable part of our exercise, a series of botanical districts. And you'll see that each province has 2 to 4 of these botanical districts. So if you like, these are the most homogeneous groups that emerged at the higher level in our analysis of these 400,000 herbarium specimens. They involve having new names if existing names didn't already occur. We've coined some, and we draw upon Noongar language for some of them. So starting at the top in the Kalbarri province, we recognise 2 districts, the Shark Bay district, and you'll see numbers beneath the word Shark Bay in the upper left of slide 3. 584, that's the number of species that occur within the Shark Bay district, and in brackets is 6, that's the number of those species that are endemic, only found in the Shark Bay district. Below Shark Bay is Nanda, which embraces Kalbarri National Park and almost makes it to Shark Bay and goes down as far as the Geraldton region. And many more species in this area. It's a larger area, but many more than you would expect in comparison to Shark Bay. So 1,963 species, 161 of which are endemic. So you can run your eye through these districts and provinces, and that immediately will give you a sense of where you'll see the most distinctive floras and the most similar floras in the southwest Australian floristic region. Slide 5 just provides detail, so it shows you the grid squares we use, the latitude longitude grid squares. Lower left is the dendrogram and classification that was derived. Top centre is the ordination, the 2-way diagram that shows you the same data in 2-dimensional space, and for comparison we've included the districts, botanical provinces and floristic region boundary Paul Joyer and I recognised in 2004. So you'll see and be able to compare what we perceived a decade or so ago with what is present today. Slide 5 works on what we call adjusted endemism. So this is endemism adjusted for collecting intensity. It's a way of trying to smooth out bias introduced by collecting intensity. And basically it's a plot of the whole southwest at 4 different scales, where red indicates a concentration of endemic plant species, yellow medium amounts of plant endemism, and white is low endemism. And we plotted it in the 4 small inset maps at different scales, from something like 30 kilometres by 30 kilometres, upper left of the 4 maps, through to around a 10,000 square kilometre square, showing different scales at which endemics can be. So they can be located in very fine areas, that's the upper left, through to broader areas. But even the broad area in this map is, from a global perspective, very narrow for plant localisation. And the overwhelming trend is a near coastal concentration of the red bits. So you can see for micro-endemics, places like the Stirling Range, Fitzgerald River National Park and the Zua National Park stand out. As you increase the size of the grid square that the endemic area is confined to, you'll see that those areas start to join up along the coast, and we end up with more or less a continuous band of red from approaching Geraldton right around to Ravensthorpe and heading over towards Esperance. It's a near coastal phenomenon and concentration of endemic plants, and that's significant, as I'll explain in a minute. Slide 6 is showing you species richness adjusted for collecting intensity, with the areas of highest richness shown in the smaller map. But the take-home message here is that the whole of the southwest globally is like a plateau of exceptional species richness. Very few places on the planet will you find red areas covering such a large area. And if you like, the plateau has been bisected in the upper right map to just clip off the very top of the small undulations on the plateau to show you the richest of the rich, if you like. And exciting things about this is, for example, Perth emerges as one of the richest of the rich cities known on the planet. Albany is the same. It's as rich as Cape Town, Rio or Sydney. If you want to see plant diversity in a capital city, Perth is one of those places on Earth. Another interesting thing is if you look at the Stirling Range Fitzgerald area where Gondwana Link is most active, it's actually the country between the Stirling Range and the Fitzgerald River National Park that is reddest and richest. The farmland, the Pallinup River catchment, the remnants of vegetation between the Stirling Range and the Fitzgerald River are richer than the already well-known rich points of the Stirling Range and Fitzgerald River. And in fact, the farmland extending from the Stirling Range down to Albany and the forest over to the west of Stirling Range and northwest of Albany are incredibly rich. And there's also little patches in the wheat belt, despite heavy clearing places like Cordering, for example, which are extraordinarily rich. So you don't have to have huge areas to still maintain incredible richness in the flora. And it means that every small patch of vegetation in these largely cleared farmland areas is incredibly important. A recent survey in Gondwana Link by Libby Sanderford of 3 bush heritage properties, a maximum distance of 13 kilometres apart, showed that the maximum shared number of species in percentage terms between these 3 adjacent areas was 30%. So move over 13 kilometres, 3 patches of bush, 30% of the species you see on the first patch you might see in the second patch. And the same again, move from the second patch into the other patch just 13 kilometres away from the original one, 30%. And that's extraordinary. To get that sort of species turnover across landscapes in Europe, you have to go from Great Britain to central Russia, or go from one side, California, to New York in the USA. So imagine that, over 13 kilometres here. This is globally rich country like few people understand or know well. And that's exemplified in slide 7 just by the genus Banksia, for example. Centre is Mount Leisure, the classic flat-topped laterite mesa that's near Jurien Bay, north of Perth. And Leisure Banksia is shown there, Banksia tricuspis. It has a total known geographical range of 12 kilometres, longest distance from one end to the other, confined entirely to these uplands. Mount Leisure is only 300 metres or so above sea level. hardly a mount in any other country's terminology. And you just run your eye around the rim, and you'll see the features of southwest Australian Banksias. Banksias are now combined the genus Dryandra. There are about 200 species or more now of Banksias known across Australia, with one species just extending into New Guinea. Only one species in tropical Australia, Banksia dentata. The vast majority, more than 80% of the species in Banksia, are found in the southwest Australian floristic region. And notice that I've got honeyeaters here, a New Holland honeyeater perched on Banksia occidentalis on the right middle, and honey possums and pygmy possums, to reinforce the fact that the vast majority of Banksias in southwestern Australia, and of Banksias in general, are pollinated by birds and mammals. Why is that so? 15% of the native flora in southwestern Australia are pollinated by vertebrates, birds and mammals. That's the highest percentage than anywhere else in the world. Only recently, last year, was it published that a small mountain range north of Rio in Brazil has 14% of its plants pollinated by hummingbirds, as it turns out. So that's the second richest. Southwest Australia is the mecca for studies of bird and mammal pollination. Europe, at the opposite extreme, no species, unless you count the Madeira Islands, Canary Islands off Africa as part of Europe. No species pollinated by birds and mammals. It's a process really poorly understood because most biologists live in Europe and North America. North America has about less than 1% of its flora pollinated by vertebrates, and that's hummingbird pollinated species, most of which are migratory from the tropics. So this vertebrate pollination syndrome is a classic feature of southwest Australia, and something we need to understand in detail. Slide 8 just illustrates where our conservation reserves are distributed, both terrestrial in green and marine in blue, for the whole state of Western Australia, with an enlargement of the Perth area. And if you look very carefully at the map at the wheat belt area inland from Perth, and occupying the southeast coastal botanical province of the southwest floristic region, and going north up into the Kalbarri area, you'll notice lots of little tiny dots, which are very small remnants of bushland in the heart of the wheat belt. And according to conventional population genetics and island biogeographic theory, size matters. Big areas are what you should get in conservation reserves. Most of our big areas are in the desert, where the flora is far less rich. They're in the Kimberley, the really big areas. Relatively few in the southwest, except for the forest regions and places like Stirling Range, Fitzgerald River National Park, Lake Magenta Nature Reserve and Kalbarri National Park. So should we just toss the small fly specks of reserves in the wheat belt into the dustbin and say, well, everything will go extinct, so why bother? I hope to convince you the short answer is no. These are just as precious as some of the larger reserves you see. And the same applies to Perth. The small remnants of native vegetation in Perth every remnant needs to be cared for and protected from destruction, for reasons that I hope will become obvious. I want to emphasise in slide 9 that single factor understandings, which we tend to go for, that this is Occam's razor in science. You go for the simplest possible explanation to explain patterns and trends in the universe. They're unlikely to apply in explaining what's going on in southwestern Australia, why the flora is so rich, why it's so highly endemic, why small reserves matter. For example, people have offered the view that it's all about the soil. The soil is a single factor that explains the diversity. But it's very easy to demonstrate that Antarctica has a mosaic of soil types almost as diverse, if not as diverse, as the soil types in southwestern Australia. Antarctica has 2 flowering plant species. So climate obviously is an extra overlay you have to apply on top of soil types. George Evelyn Hutchinson in 1965, the American ecologist, talked about the ecological theatre and the evolutionary play, which is characterised by the cartoon of Charles Darwin in Shakespearean mode in the ecological theatre in the upper right. But modern contemporary understanding really suggests that it's the 2 actors interacting dynamically. So at some stage ecology can be the background, and evolution and evolutionary processes are really fundamental, and vice versa. And in fact it's often the interaction. You can't just look at a contemporary vegetation and understand what's going on. You have to have that 4th dimension, the time dimension that evolutionary studies bring, to really nail what's going on. And so it's complex, and it's likely to be more than single factor. There's another hypothesis that I need to just present to you before getting into the body of theory I'll focus on, and that's what's called Hooker's conundrum. So Sir Joseph Hooker was Kew's deputy director when his father was running the show up until 1865, and during that time he had been on the Ross expedition in the 1840s to Antarctica. He'd visited Sydney, and he had Kew's collection of plants, which then was the richest on Earth, and he was studying patterns of diversity in plants across continents, and particularly on islands. In the 1850s he was also Charles Darwin's primary scientific friend and confidant. So Darwin claimed never to be a botanist. He actually published more botanical work than on any other topic throughout his career, and was a very able experimental botanist, but he deferred to Hooker for biogeographical knowledge of plants and taxonomic knowledge. And Hooker was writing up the botany of the Antarctic voyage of HMS Discovery ships Erebus and Terror in the years 1839 to 43, and eventually published this article called Part 3, The Flora Tasmaniae, Volume 1 on dicotyledons. So he called it the Flora of Tasmania, but it ended up being an analysis of the Australian flora as then known writ large. And he wrote to Darwin a letter saying, "It really is the most extraordinary thing in the world, the flora of the Swan River, that is, of extratropical, non-tropical southwestern Australia." And he thought it'll turn out to be the most peculiar, the most richest endemics on the globe, and specifically differing quite distinctly from that of New South Wales. So he was the first to point out that something special was really going on in southwestern Australia. His idea that it was the most distinct on the planet has had to be moderated a little bit, but the general message is in fact one that is really important. The conundrum in his observation is topographically southwestern Australia is basically a series of coastal plains and then a gently rising plateau that rises towards the northeast as you head towards the arid zone. And people in Hooker's day knew that the richest places for plants on Earth were mountain ranges, so Andes, Himalayas for example. How could a place that didn't have huge mountain ranges and all the habitat diversity that they bring be so rich in species? At the time, geologists argued that southwestern Australia was in fact a very young region geologically. It's covered in sand. Well, where does sand come from? Sand comes from the ocean, shorelines and rivers and creeks. So it must have been a place that was recently underwater, was the thinking. It also had lots of salt lakes inland. So where does the salt come from? It comes from the ocean. So it was viewed as something like the Dead Sea. And Hooker said this is anomalous because how could such a geological history deliver such plant richness? That's the conundrum we call Hooker's conundrum in a paper that Hans Lambers and I published on Charles Darwin in 2009. So you can test Hooker's conundrum, and this has been done, for example, for Australia's richest plant genus, acacia, the wattles, where the continent has been divided up into grid squares, and species richness just plotted, with again red indicating the richest areas in Australia, brownish yellow, moderately rich, and pale colour is relatively species poor. And you can see the pattern. Southwest Australia is where all the red is. There's green, is the next level of richness below the red, and that's both in southwestern Australia, a big chunk of southeastern Australia, and little patches of tropical Australia and the desert region of the Pilbara. But all the major richness of this, our largest genus with 1,100 species across Australia, is in southwestern Australia. So Hooker's observation was entirely correct. This is a species-rich area and needs explanation. So what might this unusual series of processes in the southwest Australian region be, and does it have global relevance, are the two things I want to focus on now. And that was in slide number 12. Slide number 13, in a nutshell, gives you the paper where a body of theory has been developed now, which I call Ocbil theory. The acronym stands for old, climatically buffered, and infertile. So three key factors that I think explain the phenomenon and enable us to compare southwestern Australia with other parts of the earth to see if similar patterns occur and similar hypotheses might apply. Slide number 13 more precisely defines Ocbil. So they're landscapes that have these three attributes. They're old, and by that I mean the landscape, the form of the land, the shape of the land, the hills and dales, river systems and that sort of thing, have persisted for tens of millions of years and have been above oceans at the maximum global sea levels 90 million years ago. So on slide 14, the blue map down the bottom is one that's been put together by an American research team, showing you continental versus marine environments 90 million years ago. And if you look at the bit that's got Australia there, you'll see that the outline of southwestern Australia is virtually identical to what the outline of southwestern Australia is today. Oceans have existed for two sides of the continental mass, and despite being flat, relatively flat, it's remained above sea level for more than 90 million years. Climatically buffered because oceanic influence has prevailed for up to 300 or 400 kilometres inland since the early Cretaceous in the case of southwestern Australia. And because it's been land above sea for that long period of time and not covered by things like glaciers at any period of time since, then rainfall has weathered out all the nutrients over this very long period of time, well into the Cretaceous, eking out all the nutrients, washing them downslope into the river systems and eventually out into the oceans. Notice also that you can recognise parts of other southern hemisphere continents, South America, Africa, even India. Its outline is evident 90 million years ago. But look at the land above water in the northern hemisphere. Hardly any of it is recognisable as a contemporary coastline. Interestingly, parts of Georgia, the east coast of the US, is there, but virtually everything else that you see is not a coastline in the northern hemisphere today, whereas present coastlines are instantly recognisable in the southern hemisphere. So we're talking about a predominantly, perhaps, the occurrence of ocbils with oceanic buffering being a southern hemisphere phenomenon. In slide 15, this is just a model, a three-dimensional model that illustrates the same principle. So landscape age is one axis, soil fertility another, and climatic buffering or disturbance regime is what I'm really getting at, is the third axis. So ocbils occur where landscape is maximum is old, where soil fertility is the lowest, in other words soil fertility, infertility is the highest, and where disturbance regimes are lowest, less disturbance regime or more climatic buffering. The opposite extreme, diagonally opposite Ocbils, are things called yodfils, young, often disturbed fertile landscapes. I'll explain them in a tick. And recently we've discovered there's a third point on this cube called Ocfels. So they're still old and climatically buffered, but they happen to be fertile, not infertile, because the bedrock is one that continually releases new mineral nutrients, and that's rock like dolerite, for example. So there are little patches of that in the southwest Australian region, but mostly it's the granite terrains which form Ocbils that we're interested in. Slide 16 shows you 3 photos and a cartoon section of a typical landscape that includes a mosaic of Ocbils and yodfils. So it's important to understand that not all of southwestern Australian floristic region is an Ocbil. It's parts of it, it's landscapes within it, and they're embedded in a mosaic of yodfils, of young, often disturbed fertile landscapes. So just looking at the section, starting on the left hand side, you'll see I've got an ocean or river lake and a yodfil beside it. So that's a classic place, the ocean or the lake, with its rises and falls and its constant weathering of the land, rejuvenating the fertility of the soil, creates a yodfil. Then there's a gradual rising coastal plain, which is transitional, and then you hit a small eminence or a large eminence. In southwestern Australia, it would be a small lateritic upland like the Moresby Range, shown in the top photograph, for example, capped by laterite, ironstone or sandstone. The slopes, the steeply eroding slopes, the breakaways as they're called on the lateritic mesas, are yodfils because they're constantly eroding away and soils are being exposed constantly. But the top, where the green line is indicated, is an Ocbil, old, climatically buffered, infertile. The plateau then, the high plateau on which these flat top hills are occurring, can have other forms of Ocbils, so wetlands, fresh or salt, that are elevated in these old persistent landscapes can be Ocbils, salt lake systems included. Sandplain can be the same, so high sandplain, high altitude sandplain relatively in southwestern Australia, and granite outcrops are classics, and the Namas, the Nyamas, the wetland bodies on top of them are all Ocbils, and any steeply eroding slopes are young, often disturbed fertile landscapes, yodfils. The two bottom photographs, the one on the left is taken on a granite outcrop in Good Beach, south of Albany, looking up Vancouver Peninsula at the yodfil of the isthmus. So the isthmus, you can see, has got a freshwater lake, Vancouver Lake, and then it's got sandy plains and coastal dunes that are just 7,000 years old. And then at the north end you can just see little bumps of islands and exposed granite, and you're back into Ocbil. So the really old bits can be juxtaposed and within just a few hundred metres, or sometimes directly adjacent to the really young stuff, 7,000 years old, for example. Bottom right is a photo taken across the Murchison River Valley in Kalbarri National Park. So the horizon is the classic Quonkin sandplains of Kalbarri National Park. Recent geomorphological studies estimate that's an Eocene landscape. So what you see today is what you would have seen in the Eocene. The cliffs are yodfils, rapidly eroding sandstone, and has quite a different flora on it from what's up on top in the Quonkin. And then you can see the sandy river valley stuff, which is regularly disturbed and dominated by rivet gums, and that's classic yodfil as well. That's disturbed on an annual basis almost, depending on rainfall. So that's how Ocbils and yodfils form a mosaic of landscapes. The feature of southwestern Australia is we have more Ocbils in aerial extent than most places on Earth. There are alternative models, and slide 17 shows you one that was published in 2011 by Musina and Wardle Johnson. They argued that the three parameters of old, climatically buffered and infertile, weren't the appropriate parameters to understand what's going on in places like southwestern Australia. Instead, they agreed with the climatic buffering, only they called it climatic stability. I deliberately do not use the word stability. It's buffered climate. That's important. Climate varies anywhere. I know of no place with a stable climate. But it's being buffered by oceans and stopping things like continental effects like freezing and glaciation from occurring that's critical. It's not a stable climate, and therefore I suggest they've got an untestable proposition in that first parameter there, climatic stability. They agree landscape age is important, so we're concurrent on that and no argument with that. But then instead of infertility, they argue that fire regime is critical to understand what's going on. Now I argue in a different way, and how can the sceptical person discriminate between what I'm suggesting are the three key parameters for understanding and what Musina and Wardle-Johnson are suggesting? There's a paper by Smith published in 2015 to do with the establishment of agricultural crops, in fact, in the Journal of Archaeological Research, which came up with the tools for helping you discriminate between conflicting theory and hypotheses. And it's about getting clearly defined attributes that you're looking at and measuring, forming clear hypotheses about processes that are predictive, ensuring that it's a plausible set of hypotheses. It's based on what we understand presently, it's at least not impossible that this could be going on, and then testing by measuring data. And that way you could discriminate between Ocbil theory and what Musina and Wardle-Johnson are proposing. They discount infertility because they say, well, infertility is just a product of an old landscape. It's weathered by rainfall and becomes infertile always. And I say, well, no, actually, we now know of Ocbils. If the underlying geology is different and has fertile mineral rocks like dolerite, then you'll get old, climatically buffered, fertile landscapes. They can be just as old as Ocbils, but they're fertile, not infertile, and it's because the geology underlying it is different. Geology of most Ocbils is either granite or it's sandstone. So if that's the case, then it's not a direct conclusion that old landscapes will always be infertile, and so that falsifies Musina and Wardle-Johnson's hypothesis. They also don't develop explicit hypotheses in their paper with predictions that you can test. They just basically use it as a way of saying that old climatically stable places that are subjected to a frequent fire are where you're going to get patterns that I pick up in Ocbils of species richness, high endemism and the like. Fire regime to me is just a form of disturbance, one of many forms of disturbance. There is flooding, there's glaciation, there's grazing, there's desert storms bringing in fertile soil and putting it over an old landscape. All those forms, the marine processes, all those forms of disturbance exist. And to just zero in on one form of disturbance like fire and say that is critical in a landscape like the diversity we have in southwestern Australia would require, to be convincing, and from my point of view, careful experimentation that showed that it was false to regard marine and lacustrine flooding as a key disturbance more important than fire, or grazing was, you'd have to falsify the idea that grazing was more important or as important as fire, or mineralised dust storms being more important, and simply that evidence doesn't exist. The only concrete correlation we have is that oceanic climatic buffering as a disturbance, a minimised dampened disturbance, is a characteristic of Ocbils. So for all those reasons I reject Musina and Wardle-Johnson's alternative model, and I'll now explain Ocbils. So why study them? They could be drivers of accentuated evolution and ecological relationships that are rarely investigated. They do fill, this body of theory does fill a significant gap in mainstream evolutionary theory. And I'll explain why. They're prominent in southwest Australia, the Greater Cape of South Africa, Venezuela's Pantapui, parts of Brazil, eastern Australia and Madagascar. And novel biological discovery of the kinds, for example, that Hans Lambers is pursuing on nutrient mining and extraction by native plants abound in Ocbils across countries. So, and there are important conservation implications. So on slide 19 I also show with the red circles that there are 35 global biodiversity hotspots now recognised. These are places richest in endemic species under threat on the planet. 12 of these are rich in Ocbils, and almost all of them are in the southern hemisphere. Only the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka and the Guinean forests of West Africa are northern hemisphere. So places, they're important for conservation reasons. We have to understand what's going on with biodiversity if we're to conserve what's going on. Slide 20 just illustrates the fact that most landscapes are yodfuls, young, often disturbed, fertile. And I use a slide of the planet at night showing where light is coming from to illustrate where most humans are found. It's a rough correlation, but you can see it's mostly northern hemisphere and coastal regions of southern hemisphere. And Charles Darwin is in there just to emphasise that he grew up in Yodful country in the UK, post-glacial, just 7,000 years to 12,000 years ago. There were periglacial areas where he grew up. He understood plants and animals from Yodfuls. He studied them in mountain ranges and the coastlines of South America for 4 years on the Beagle journey, and only visited Ocbil regions when he came back across the Pacific, spent a little bit of time in Sydney, in King George Sound and near Albany, went to the Cocos Islands and across to Cape Town, over to Rio and back to London. And his journal just talks about boring, useless, infertile country in sandstones of Sydney, in the Albany environment, and even in Cape Town, which has the richest temperate flora on the earth. Nothing much of interest to study, he commented. He was perennially seasick and homesick, so you could probably excuse him. And it wasn't until his later years that he began to realise that something else was going on in these so-called boring, useless places that he should have paid much more attention to. Slide 21 just gives you a photographic illustration of Yodfuls, young, often disturbed, fertile landscapes, volcanic lands, steep slopes, coastal lands, post-glacial lands, wetland floodplains and windswept plains. And most of planet Earth is land is covered by these sorts of landscapes these days, primarily because a global glaciation in the northern hemisphere covered much of Eurasia and North America and just a few of the mountaintops in the southern hemisphere, and rejuvenated what might have been Ocbil's old climatically buffered infertile landscapes just 20,000 years ago. So if you read island biogeography theory, old field succession theory, population genetics theory, vast majority of the literature focuses on plants and animals from Yodfuls. And as a generalisation, the parameters that you observe are that they have good dispersal mechanisms. Anything that can move quickly into recently disturbed fertile land will inherit the earth. They're good colonisers. They're often common and widespread species, not narrow localised endemics. They can often be recently evolved from recently evolved lineages rather than old lineages that have persisted and not gone extinct. They'll be nutritional and biological generalists, able to feed on anything, tolerant of human disturbance, tolerant of disturbance more generally, intolerant of fragmentation and being rare. So fragmenting is not a good idea at all, and they will often have low population genetic and species diversity on these young landscapes. Now, if you accept them as a general theoretical summary of Yodful organisms, then what does it mean for land use? Well, it means land use practices are largely and widely transferable. Farm in Europe is the same as a farm in North America, or a farm on a fertile river alluvial plain in Australia, in terms of what you might expect in response to farming. Furthermore, native vegetation must be constantly suppressed to make way. Old field succession theory comes from this. So abandon a farm in the UK, within a year you'll have oak seedlings and bramble seedlings in the middle of the paddock. Within 10 years you'll have an incipient woodland and forest. Within 20 years you've got one, without humans doing anything. And within reason, this is a rather heretical suggestion, but earth-moving disturbances like tilling, mining, logging, nutrient addition, removing groundwater are environmentally inconsequential. You can stop those sort of disturbances and the native flora will have a chance of coming back because it disperses well. Introducing exotic organisms for our purposes may be relatively benign. Not always. There are some pernicious weeds, some feral animals that just get out of control, but by and large may be benign. So that's the sort of land use implication, and you can imagine Europeans therefore colonising southern hemisphere in places rich in ocbils and just applying these sort of land uses and discovering that things didn't work. Sydney is a classic example. They nearly starved when Sydney was colonised, and the first farm was on the ocbils of the Sydney Hawkesbury sandstone. Conservation principles that flow from this is, for yodfuls, is you just need to provide space. So allow room for native organisms, and plants will colonise them like the abandoned farmlands. That individual remnants of wild vegetation are interchangeable due to low endemism. So if you want to mine an area in yodful landscapes, then you just find a bit of bush that's uncleared and purchase that, and you say, well, here you go, you can have that patch of land, so I can destroy the bushland on the patch that I want to mine, and the biodiversity will be the same. So it's a fair exchange. I've mentioned bigger is better in island biogeography theory, the single large or several small debate for nature reserve design, SLOS debate. And that makes a lot of sense for widespread organisms, plants and animals that readily disperse. They are like human beings. They're rich in diversity within populations. They don't show much genetic differentiation geographically, and they occur in large populations by and large. Ongoing forms of human disturbance can be helpful if they mimic natural disturbances. And connecting fragments of yodful organisms with corridors is highly desirable. You read a lot about corridors, vegetation corridors, as being the best thing since sliced bread, for example, in conservation literature. And to do revegetation, then sourcing seeds from wide areas for restoration is fine. These are things that move rapidly across landscapes. If they have low geographical differentiation going on, most of the variation is within populations, then it doesn't matter if you get your seed from where your restoration site is, or 50 or 100 or even 200 kilometres away. It doesn't matter. It's more or less the same gene pool. So that begs the question of what happens when you go into ocbils. Do you have the same conservation principles applying? And as people in particular move into ocbils, sometimes forced into ocbils by dominant cultures, what happens? Slide number 26 now gives you the principal hypotheses developed in the two papers indicated there. The first one I published in 2009 in Plant and Soil, and the second one an update in 2016 with co-authors in the same journal. And there are 7 principal ideas. If you just think about the fact that these are landscapes that have sat above water, unchanged in general form, for tens of millions of years, close to oceans and therefore climatically buffered, and are infertile, you would expect accentuated persistence of landscape leads to accentuated persistence of lineages. This is what I call the Gondwanan heritage hypothesis. You would expect therefore a mixture of old, persistent, non-extinct lineages alongside more recently evolved. You would also expect reduced dispersibility. It's not ideal under natural selection to actually move your propagules long distances if you live in an ocbil. Why? Because you've got to land in a similar ocbil environment, and if that's already occupied and not being disturbed much at all, then you've got no hope of colonising. Your best bet is to sit beside mum as a plant and wait for her to die to create a gap where you as a seed pool will be in the very topsoil, and some of you will grow up and occupy that space that she's occupied. And that leads to, therefore, to increased local endemism and rarity. So you can end up with species being confined to very small spaces. That's a prediction of Ocbil. You need to deal with the inbreeding effects that come from that, and so you would expect natural selection to favour mechanisms that retain heterozygosity or genetic variation in very small populations. That's what I call the James effect, after Sid James, a very eminent population geneticist from Perth, who's now no longer with us. You would expect prolonged speciation at the margins of Ocbil, what I call the semi-arid cradle hypothesis. The idea was coined by Ledyard Stebbins, a Californian botanist in the 1940s and 50s. And it's all about, if you've got this pool of persisting islands of vegetation of ancient lineages, then they're going to generate new species by getting onto the margins and being subjected to a bit more disturbance and that sort of thing, and generating therefore new populations. Nutritional and other biological specialisation would be rampant. If you grow in a local area and have to live on infertile soils, you've got to work out ways of doing it, and Hans Lambers and his team have done wonderful recent work in that area. You can adapt to saline soils. If there are ancient saline paleo rivers that have become salt through rainfall, the tiny amount of salt in rainfall, if it accumulates for long enough over tens of millions of years, can turn water systems that don't flow saline. And special vulnerability and resilience. So the special vulnerabilities are to do with removal of topsoil. Bulldozing, for example, is like a glacier. It takes away, strips away the above ground vegetation and the topsoil. Do that on Ocbils and you set the clock back. And the only way you can get native things, by and large, back into that landscape is by physically placing the propagules into that landscape. Do that in a yodful, the widely dispersed inflow of seeds that's happening constantly, the abandoned farm paddock, think of that again, and it'll re-establish without human interference. The resilience relates to the ability to persist in very small isolated populations, which is completely bad news for yodful organisms, but standard, I would argue, in Ocbils. So, if those hypotheses apply, and we can test them, let's just think through what would be the conservation implications of caring for Ocbil landscapes. Firstly, providing space is fundamental, just like it is in young landscapes. You have to not convert the vegetation into some other land use, leave it as native. So small and isolated may be persistent and sufficient for persistence in Ocbils. I mentioned fragmentation, really bad news for yodful organisms. Fragmentation doesn't matter as long as the islands of old landscapes are not bulldozed. If the islands are left, even though they're fragmented, you can have farms in between or cities or whatever, it's far less consequential for an Ocbil landscape as long as edge effects don't impinge on it. So spread of fertiliser drift, human disturbance that is destructive of native vegetation caused by urban populations, for example. It's absolutely critical to not mess with the topsoil. Absolutely critical. And that's an Ocbil characteristic. It's also important to understand the implications of climate change. So Ocbils have lineages that have persisted for tens of millions of years through the worst that the Pleistocene glaciations threw climatically at the world. So in the northern hemisphere it was catastrophic because glaciers formed and wiped the slate clean. In the southern hemisphere on Ocbils they escaped glaciation, for example. So the climate change that's going on now, even though it's rapid and human induced, isn't necessarily catastrophic for Ocbil organisms unless you reach critical thresholds about which we understand almost zero. It's not advisable, in my view, to start moving around propagules of Ocbil organisms with what's called assisted migration, because you're messing with population systems that are millions of, if not tens of millions of years old, and we just don't understand how complex they are, nor how they function. To do it for yodful organisms is eminently sensible. You would expect micro-refugia, more or less, in Ocbils, that is, tiny places where lineages of plants and animals have persisted for very long periods of time. Invasion biology is fundamentally different. Strip the topsoil of an Ocbil, you open it up for weed and feral animal occupation immediately. It can flip the system overnight. And minimising human disturbance is really important. The most important thing you could do if you have a granite rock or a laterite upland or a high sand plain on your farm or in your city is not mess with it. Leave it as is. Study it, try and understand it, protect it from edge effects, for sure. get onto any weeds or feral animals that are impinging on it, but don't start messing with the native plants until you understand those population systems. And fire is just such a complex system, fire regimes, that to suggest that things will adapt to fire is a pregnant hypothesis rich in traps for young players. And I would be very cautious about just assuming that because places are burnt and things are coping with fire, that they are adapted to fire, and therefore you can use fire with impunity in these old landscapes. Slide number 28, I won't go in detail. I just want to make the point that theory, published in 2009, has generated lots of novel hypotheses and new insights across a range of disciplines, and just ask you to have a look at that slide and look at the references indicated if you want to follow up on what's going on. Obviously it's generated criticisms as well as accolades. It's reinvigorated academic debate in aspects of restoration ecology and fire ecology, but it's an area that's relatively new and in need of lots of rigorous science. Slide 29 is just making the point that we are now increasingly understanding that the hypotheses in Ocbil theory do apply to other places on the Earth, as I've mentioned, mostly southern hemisphere. So people are starting to publish papers now where the Hawkesbury Basin sandstones in Sydney, for example, seem to be behaving like classic Ocbils. Brazil's Campo Rupestre, this mountain range north of Rio that I mentioned, is another place. Queensland, the wet tropics, another place. The sandstones of the Kimberley, parts of Madagascar, other parts of South Africa. And a research group at UWA has said not only the terrestrial environment, but the inshore, nearshore marine environment of southwestern Australia is behaving like an Ocbil, an Ocbiz as it's called, an old climatically buffered infertile seascape. And the organisms seem to be responding in similar ways to the predictions of Ocbil hypotheses. It's the only coastal environment on the planet that has a warm tropical temperate current, the Lewin current, feeding it. All other west coasts in temperate latitudes have cold currents, like the Benguela current running up the west coast of South Africa. The Lewin current is estimated to have been functioning for at least 40 million years. And so you get things like the prediction of old lineages and old individuals. I didn't mention that earlier, but the ultimate self hypothesis of Sid James is the one I'm alluding to here. Ocbils would favour selection of long-lived individuals, and so the plant life of southwestern Australia is in fact dominated by long-lived woody perennials. They're the common life form, most common life form. And as you start looking at these other areas on Earth, you find it's the same. It's what Charles Darwin called the useless scrub on sandstone plateaus that Sydney was dominated by, for example. It's all scrawly banksias and grevilleas and eucalypts and the like, that not handsome forests and all that sort of stuff. So the Ocbizes, the seascapes, have the same thing going on. Long-lived individuals occur in Groper, for example, a near-shore species that individuals will live for decades, if not longer. And marine biologists are beginning to explore this idea in southwestern Australia, near-shore environments. And in animals too. Just one example on slide 30 of a little group of trapdoor spiders, which were called Mogrigia until last year, 2016, when the new genus Bertmania, named for southwestern Australia's eminent zoologist who passed away a few years ago. So this is a genus found only in southern Australia. Bertmania, or Mogrigia as it was then called. Mogrigia also is an African genus and occurs in Madagascar now only. And this is some DNA work that shows that originally it was thought just one species of Mogrigia occurred, Mogrigia tingle, in southwestern Australia, where all the coloured dots are. The high rainfall zone that I defined in 1979 is shaded in grey here, so that's the forested areas. But the molecular data show that there are at least 4 species, and arguably more of Mogrigia of highly localised endemics in the Stirling Range, in the Prongerups, in the Granite Hills just to the east of Albany, where the really localised stuff is, and then there's Tingle itself, the widespread species that occurs from the Jarrah Forest near Bunbury right down to the Walpole area. So classic Ocbil distribution, lots of localised endemics on the elevated parts of the landscape that are speciated, and if you apply molecular clock data approach to these data, you find the divergence was millions of years ago in this system. Very exciting to see that in animals that don't move much around the landscape, same patterns as many plants. Slide 31 brings us on to cross-cultural studies. So I just want to conclude with a few slides on this. And the notion here is that if first peoples have lived in these southern hemisphere regions that are rich in ocbils, like the granite rocks and the elevated uplands of southwestern Australia, like the tepuis in Venezuela and Brazil, the Table Mountain sandstone and granite regions of South Africa, they've all had first peoples, and in fact our own species, Homo sapiens, increasingly looks like it evolved on the coast of South Africa, in a place adjacent to and including ocbils. Then maybe there are cultural adaptations to living in these landscapes that will help us better understand how to care for country, how to care for biodiversity. And slide 31 just shows you one example of a cultural innovation on ocbils that appears to be a Noongar, a southwest Aboriginal nation invention. They're called lizard traps, or Carter Maya. Carter is the goanna, which was the preferred reptile species that was eaten and still is eaten by Noongar people. And the idea is fairly simple, that reptiles on sheet rock go for dark spaces for shelter and to escape predators, to escape extreme environments like heat waves and rain. And so you can increase the abundance of such areas on granite outcrops by getting slabs of rock that are human-sized in terms of movability, and just propping up one end of them with a prop stone that's usually fist-sized and is a single stone, but it can be two stones, one on top of each other, or one stone that's flat, that's vertically arranged. And this increases the habitat of these animals for shelter, and if you like, as a form of rangeland farming of reptiles that are edible. So who invented farming first? Noongars have been on these landscapes, walking on them, living amongst them for 50, 60,000 years. This is animal husbandry by any definition of that term. The inset just shows you one of the beautiful, what I regard as the tastiest of native foods in southwestern Australia. It's in the genus Platysarchy. It's in the carrot family. It can produce a crop of spuds like are in the hand there within 2 years of planting in a row crop situation, so a potential agricultural crop. And it was farmed by Noongar women, and it occurs on the high sand plains and also along the sand plains running along rivers and creeks and around lakes in Noongar country. So it occurs both in ocbils and yodfils, and shows that a form of agriculture was being prosecuted by Noongar women, both with the Carter Maya, the lizard traps, but also with food plants. So yes, there's evidence of utilitarian use of ocbils, and we're investigating now whether cultural, spiritual attitudes and camping and approaches to the use of fire was also influenced with Noongars, depending on what position in the landscape they occurred, and indeed getting positive evidence towards that end. So lastly, just in a couple of slides, and I just want to emphasise that UWA Albany, we have a group now of postdocs, PhD students, honours students, master's students, who are working with me and local and international co-supervisors to try and test experimentally some of the ideas on ocbils and yodfils that I've shared with you to advance understanding of biological and cultural diversity in ocbils, and most importantly to see if we can devise new ways of living sustainably with biodiversity in some of these most unusual and interesting landscapes. So slide 33 just gives you a sense of the range of projects that we're looking at, and I won't explain in detail any of this, but by reflecting on what I've just talked to you about, I hope you'll see the connection with Ocbil theory and some of the topics that are illustrated visually and summarised here in a few words, and some of the importance for cultural studies, cross-cultural studies as well. I want to emphasise lastly that if we are to care for biodiversity, many of the tools exist. First Peoples are showing us new ways to think about it, and ultimately it's about mainstreaming. It's about involving whole communities, not just leaving it to the government or leaving it to scientists, or leaving it to Aboriginal people on Aboriginal lands. And it's about working together cross-culturally, so that I can't overemphasise the importance of friends of groups that involve community in caring for patches of land these days. One key cultural idea of Aboriginal people is that you have totem animals and plants that become you become them. You have to know and understand them and care for them. You can't kill them, you have to nurture them. And if it's very hard for an individual to care for 8,000 species of native plants in southwestern Australia, but dead easy for every one of us in every school classroom, every business, every organisation to adopt one or two plant totems and commit to lifelong learning about those and caring for them. The same with animals, and the same with even processes like use of fire or understanding wetlands. And I believe Quongan vegetation, which is the shrubby vegetation that's mostly found on Ocbils, along with Hans Lambers and other eminent scientists in southwestern Australia, the Quongan remnants that we have, the important national parks, nature reserves and private lands that have Quongan on them, really should become a collective of World Heritage status, equivalent to the Gondwanan rainforest patches that are a World Heritage site in New South Wales and southern Queensland. So we're fortunate enough in southwestern Australia to live in a place that offers globally unique opportunities for research, teaching and community understanding. And to sum up, that the conservation, evolutionary and cultural implications of these three things, landscape age, geo-historical disturbance regimes and soil fertility or infertility, might and indeed does provide a rich field for new scientific inquiry that has profound, I believe, practical implications at mesoscales, just the right scale for people who care for country and manage it, and for working out ways of living sustainably. Secondly, we have, these are very early ideas. This is relatively new science, and it does need rigorous independent testing. I fully expect that some aspects of what I've told you will be falsified in the future. Other aspects may hold true. And it does apply and is being investigated worldwide, especially now in Brazil, for example. But finally, the precautionary principle suggests we should not apply mainstream theory, developed mainly in the Northern Hemisphere, on yodful organisms, on young, often disturbed fertile landscapes, unthinkingly. We shouldn't apply it unthinkingly at the local level. We should let country speak to us. So manage yodfuls in southwestern Australia as mainstream conservation biology, oilfield succession theory, population genetics theory suggests, but get up on the granite outcrop or the lateritic mesa or the high sandplain, and you're looking at the Mona Lisas of the biodiversity world, the irreplaceable jewels that shouldn't be messed with unless we have profound understanding of how they're functioning ecologically and in an evolutionary sense. Aboriginal people have had the start up on us. They've had 50 to 60,000 years of understanding of these systems. Maybe we should work with them, respect their knowledge and collaborate with them and come up with better ways of caring for these global biological jewels.